Welcome to this week's edition of Journalist Roundtable. I'm Francine Schertzer. Our guests this week are John Finnerty, Bureau Chief with Capitolwire.com, Linda Stein, News Editor with the Delaware Valley Journal, and Stephen Caruso, Capitol Reporter with Spotlight PA. It's been roughly about a month since the governor has made his budget address. Now that the budget hearings are in full swing, what issues are at the top of mind for lawmakers?
You know, looking at the commentary we're seeing, I think education has to be top of the list. How does Pennsylvania deal with the Supreme Court, or the Commonwealth Court ruling from last year saying that the legislature had been inequitably funding its poorest school districts? So, you know, the ruling itself was kind of absent on how to solve that. I think there even is a line that says, you know, the solutions could be endless. Lawmakers, including, and then Josh Pierce's administration did approve a report that suggested the state should put billions of new dollars into education. I mean, the exact number might be I think it's about the $9 billion range when you add up every single thing from new money right to schools, to school repairs, to mental health, to student teacher training. So, you know, that's a big price tag, and the state has reserves right now, but keeping that spending sustainable could be difficult. You know, so what you also then have Republicans countering, you know, pointing out the fact is that will require new revenue. The state does run a structural deficit, and, you know, as the ruling said, the solutions are nearly endless. So what if we try and reform schooling more? What if we do some structural changes that mean that we don't have to put as much money up front? So I think, you know, it's about spending and the amount Shapiro wants to spend, but I think a lot of that's being driven by education.
The governor's proposal is roughly $48.3 billion, including he'd like to borrow $2 billion from the rainy day fund. Linda, how receptive are lawmakers to this proposal?
Well, my impression is, at least on the Republican side, they're not too thrilled with that idea. They're worried that there may be tax increases, maybe not this year from it, but in years coming down the pike, you know, and they're also saying that it's illegal to borrow from the rainy day fund for new programs under the Constitution. So there's that. But I think they do agree that we need to do something to improve education. So, I mean, but we do spend $21,000 right now per kid in state funds, which is the 12th highest in the country.
John,
it's not enough.
I'm sorry, John, you've been covering the budget hearings quite a bit. In particular, there's been a spotlight on the governor's proposal for higher education to make a higher education more affordable for someone within a certain tax bracket that would attend a state system or a community college. Can you talk a little bit about what the governor's proposing and what you've heard from some of the stakeholders that have testified in the last week or two?
Sure. Again, this is it's the two-pronged problem we have here in Pennsylvania, where we have, you know, so much we spend on public schools, and then it seems like historically we've kind of underfunded our higher education, and that's kind of translated into rising tuition costs and declining enrollment, both in the PASHE system, particularly in the western part of the state, where not only is it just getting unaffordable, but you're having enrollment, just population declines have contributed to, you know, the areas where there used to be more people, there's fewer people, so there's fewer kids looking to go to college there. So the governor has kind of rolled out this plan where he wants to roll the community colleges and PASHE into one combined system. And there seems to be a broad consensus that there's some merit in the idea of finding ways to particularly make it easier for kids to transfer. You know, if you go to community college, a certain number of kids just want to get their certificate and graduate and get a job, but lots of them want to do 2 years and then go to another school. And a lot of times they run into trouble with finding, you know, colleges accepting all the credits. So there seemed to be some broad consensus that, you know, that would be a big win for everybody if they could make it just more seamless for, you know, if you go to community college, you can then take all your credits to go to the PASHE system. There's less enthusiasm about this idea of creating this new organization and sort of like how you would run it. You know, you have all these, basically everyone's got their spot in the sand, and no one wants to give it up. So that's kind of what came out in some of these hearings, whereas everyone's saying, you know, look, there's merit in trying to figure out how we work better together, but no one wants to give up control of their own little fiefdom.
Stephen, did you like to add to that?
No, I mean, I think that's going to be the case of any budgetary fight. I mean, I think higher ed is such a good example of it, but I feel like that's sort of some of the commentary that you hear, especially from Republican lawmakers, is so like what we're talking about right now is state spending out of the general fund. That's where like the main bank account. That's where you collect most of your tax revenues. But there's also then billions more spent out of special funds, which get funding from different places. And if you're a special interest group, the best thing you want is get one of these little special funds that goes right to your cause. And that's kind of, I think, always going to be a central debate within our budget season is, how do you make sure that you fund everything right and streamline it, but not step into somebody's sandbox, as John put it.
Well, let's talk about another budget proposal. That is, the governor is looking at $288 million for public transit systems. Can you talk a little bit about where that would come from and any impact it might have on other budgetary items, particularly transportation?
Well, no, I mean, and that's a great point. That's one of those special funds. There's a public transit trust fund that the state automatically directs. I think it's right now we're about $2 billion in sales tax revenue. So this is money that normally would go into the state's main bank account, that general fund. But because of a law passed, because of the state's transportation funding laws from the late 2000s, early 2010s, that money just goes into this fund that then directs it out to all the state's public transit agencies. Obviously, that includes SEPTA. They're the biggest recipient. It includes PRT, Pittsburgh's Regional Transit, but also small agencies across the state. I mean, Harrisburg has buses, Scranton has buses, Allentown has buses, and even rural agencies. But Shapiro has proposed bumping up that transfer by about a 0.75 percentage points, so $283 million in the most recent year, because public transit agencies right now are hitting a cliff. They're starting to run out of money that the feds gave them during the pandemic. Their ridership has started to rebound, but it's still not quite there. And there's this, they need to readjust. So the idea is, give them a little bit of extra state funding. I think as it goes back to is like the state could afford a lot of the things that Shapiro is proposing, from public transit to education to medical debt relief to economic development this year. But it's just more of, that's $283 million. That's not going to then balance the budget in future years when the projections aren't as rosy for how much money the state will have, which is what is kind of fundamentally the debate. It's not about even this year. It's about what are we doing in 3, 4, 5, 6 years.
Which, again, this is something we hear every year. We went through with Tom Wolf every single year, where Tom Wolf would say, let's spend, gazillions of dollars, and the Republicans would say, we can't afford that because there's a, recession coming. And it hasn't come yet, and that I think Senator Hughes brought this up in the appropriation hearing, where they're with the IFO, where they're saying the IFO's estimating $1 billion less every year than the administration. And he said, well, that happens every single year, where the governor comes out with a plan and the IFO comes out with a plan, and they're $1 billion off, and we're still here with billions of dollars in the rainy day fund.
Linda, what would this kind of boosted funding mean for southeastern PA?
Well, I think SEPTA has real issues. One of the main issues is safety. Now the legislature had passed a special prosecutor for SEPTA in the city of Philadelphia, and DA Larry Krasner doesn't like that idea because it would take some of his power away, some of his cases, and so he's fighting against it, and nothing's been done. And people are, some are concerned about riding SEPTA because there's so much crime. So that's a huge issue for SEPTA. And I guess other transit agencies, too, are not seeing their ridership increase.
Stephen, the governor is also proposing a 20% tax if recreational marijuana is legalized. How would that compare to other states?
20% would be, once you add on to the state's sales tax, 6%. That'd be higher than a lot of our neighbors, which also brings up the point, which is most of our neighboring states have legalized marijuana. As an issue, though, it's complicated. I mean, in Pennsylvania, you have to balance a lot of competing interests. That's even on the pro-legalization side. You touch people who are opposed. You can go at the fact that, there needs to be more, there's a need for more studies. You also might have to spend some of those tax monies that we'd get from the sale on mental health services, on addiction services. It's a complicated issue. And also, I should note, too, it's a lobbied issue. This is not an issue that it isn't just people showing up to the Capitol with legalize it flags saying lawmakers, I want to be able to smoke this. It's an industry. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry, and whether we're talking about tobacco, or talking about alcohol, or talking about marijuana, there's going to be a lot of interest at play in. So, Shapiro's proposed tax rate is pretty high. The industry has said that. They're concerned about border bleed. They're concerned about a black market if that happens. I think just in general, getting a legalization bill through the General Assembly, where there's still social conservatives who would say we shouldn't do this, it's tricky. It's really tricky. If they can get it done by June is anyone's guess. But, there are a lot of details to hash out if the state was to legalize marijuana.
Agriculture Secretary Russell Redding appeared before one of the budget hearings in the past week or so. John, you had covered his appearance. What did he have to say about his agency potentially overseeing the launch of legal marijuana?
Yeah, I mean, again, it was like a lot of these things, the details aren't really clear. What he had said basically was, you're growing a crop, and that's what we do. So it makes sense that we would oversee it. You have seen pushback, I think, from some of the industry groups who would kind of say, it'd make more sense to have sort of like a just marijuana board oversee it. But again, it's all pretty flexible. Like you said, what happens in June is probably not going to be anything close to what we think it's going to look like,
And
I do know anecdotally that people are coming over, going over into New Jersey where it's legal from the Philadelphia area to get it. I've heard people talk about it.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, border bleed is happening whether Pennsylvania likes it or not. And I think John brought up a good point, too, about the fact that Shapiro's plan was basically just a tax rate and his hope to spend some money on, helping communities that have been communities of color that have been harmed by legalization, putting some money in the state police. There weren't a lot of details in Shapiro's proposal. It basically said we should legalize marijuana. It's something that should happen. And a lot of those details I mentioned, the messy details, how much money do you put to communities of color? How many licenses go to folks like that? Can you grow marijuana at home as a consumer, or is that banned? How do you get rid of the records of people who might be in jail or just have something on their record because they smoke something that's now illegal? All those are nitty-gritty details that are really important for lawmakers that Shapiro's plan so far has been absent on. I've had some folks say privately since the plan dropped, it's like if they want something done, like Shapiro administration is going to have to step in and really get involved. So far, they haven't been forthcoming any more details. So, it's another thing to throw into the budget stew.
I'd like to shift gears and talk a little bit about minimum wage now. There have been all kinds of numbers thrown around. Governor Shapiro is proposing $15 an hour. Senate Majority Leader Pittman said that that's too much. And then, Linda, you had covered a Zoom town hall meeting with Representative Rabb. He had recommended, I believe, $21 an hour. Can you talk a little bit about some of the reactions you hear from the numbers that are being tossed around?
Well, it seems like it's all over the place. Obviously, if you're a minimum wage worker, you certainly want your pay to increase and the minimum wage to grow up. But then if you're a business owner, you have to weigh making your payroll and can you afford to hire more people, or even you're going to have to lay off people, especially if you're going from whatever it is to 15 or even 21. And some of the business owners I talked to said they're already paying 15 because it's such a tight job market out there that they can't get people to work for them or work for anybody too. So there's that.
And that's one of the issues is, we're stuck at $7.25 as sort of the floor, but I think everyone concedes that most of the state, what you could effectively call the effective minimum wage is more like $11 or $12 an hour. And I think that, that makes it, you would think that would make it fairly easy for Senate Republicans or House Republicans to say, yeah, we could do 10 or 12 bucks an hour because no one's even going to notice that. But then on the flip side of that is if you're a Democrat or an advocate for low wage workers, the same is true. No one's going to notice it if you only move it to 12. So we need to go to 15 or we need to go higher because particularly in the southeastern part of the state, you need to make that much more money. So that's really where, even if we say, okay, it's possible it happens this year, the nugget's going to be sort of where do you draw that line to actually make a difference?
The independent
and
fiscal...
in some remarks after the budget, I reported on this, Senator Pittman did say he's willing to negotiate on this.
John, the Independent Fiscal Office testified about this. What was their perspective on what things would look like if the minimum wage was increased?
Yeah, I mean, certainly they're saying, there would, they projected some job loss, but the job loss number was I believe it was only like 20,000 jobs, and I think most of that, they conceded would be just not filling vacancies, and wouldn't be, people wouldn't be getting laid off. It's just if someone left, you would absorb it by not filling a vacancy. But again, in a state with 13 million people, if hundreds of thousands of people get a raise and 20,000 jobs disappear, it's kind of a tough argument to make.
And, I think Linda mentioned the need to negotiate, I think it's sort of where does the number come from? And so far it's we have the 15 number that House Dems voted for. You have advocates like Chris Rapp, progressives who'd push it higher. There's also, and then, the Senate in 2019 actually passed a $9.75 minimum wage bill. Kim Ward and Joe Pittman, current GOP leadership, were some of the handful of no votes on that. But, that was 2019. But, that's a number that's thrown out. And then the $12 minimum wage was thrown out by House Republicans during the debate. It actually got about 40 or so votes out of their caucus last year. So, I think it's just, how do you get everybody to talk? Because I think there's clearly some sort of okay, we all could live with a number. It's just, will everyone sit at the table and hammer that number out? I don't know. That's what we wait to see.
Stephen, I'd like to come back to you because you had written about the governor's proposal to tax and regulate skills games. Can you explain what these skills games are, and if this were to be taxed and regulated, what kind of revenue this might generate?
Yeah, so skill games are, your viewers might have seen them pop up in convenience stores and bars and restaurants and VFWs and any sort of social hall. They're the games that say usually Pennsylvania skill on the side. It's like a video game where it does cost you money to play. It'll pay you out cash. It'll have something that's maybe a memory game or something to that effect. I'll be honest, I haven't played one of them, but I've seen people play them at least. And the general pitch of the producers say is that this isn't gambling. That's why it has skill in it. That there is this element of memory of your ability to track a pattern that lets you win, and therefore it's not the same as just pulling down a slot machine and hoping that you get 3 cherries. And so because of that, they've argued that they are legal. That the casinos who are regulated and pay a very hefty tax on their winnings, that's about in the neighborhood of 50%. They say otherwise because the gambling market, it doesn't grow that much. It's kind of just a pie that you divide up among people. And the skill games coming in, putting their machines in all these places is potentially taking people away from going to casinos. So that's kind of debate, and as I mentioned, this is another debate that attracts a lot of money and interest and attention, but Shapiro hopes that if we legalize skill games, which the manufacturers have been pushing for quite a bit of time, that'll bring in, I think it's a neighborhood of $250, $300 million in revenue every year. And going back to that central question of this budget of there's a lot of things to spend on, but we need sustainable revenue, it's another piece of the budget, another piece of the pie, but, it once again navigates a very tricky political issue because of all the money and interest that's staked into this topic.
The alternative to that is, the games exist and they're everywhere. And so this idea, it's going to be a little hard to put Pandora back in the box. So legalizing, setting some sort of rule probably makes some sense.
Stephen, I have to mention in your article, you talked to an anonymous lawmaker who said that they get donations from representatives on both sides of this issue. Is this something that lawmakers are hesitant to take a position on?
It's a hesitancy. I think it's just, as I mentioned, it's an issue that's heavily lobbied. It's an issue where everyone throws money around. I guess hesitancy, I think, implies that people have strong opinions on it. What I'd say is, I don't think anyone actually has very strong opinions on gaming outside of, people who are morally opposed to it. I think it's more of it's one of those issues because everyone's coming at you with checks and opinions and takes that sometimes it's easier for the legislature to do nothing, and we get to that on many, many issues.
And some local areas are trying to zone for that and keep them out of certain places, such as not being too near schools or not being in convenience stores, but or tobacco stores, but maybe in bars. So where the state is not stepping up to the plate, the local municipalities are.
The governor today is announcing that an election threats task force aimed at protecting the election from any kind of interference. Does anybody want to talk a little bit about what we know about this so far and how this will, unravel or materialize?
It will be chaired by Al Schmidt, the Secretary of State of Pennsylvania, so he's in charge of managing our elections or giving that statewide oversight. I think it came out as a press release this morning. So far, I think it's more just trying to get a sense of, what does this mean? Because a task force can just be a bunch of people talking heads in a room, or it can be, affirmative action. By the state on something. I think the main question, as with Pennsylvania's election law, is always going to be this lack of uniformity. Republican senators have brought this up. I think even county election officials have brought this up in red and blue counties. Right now, there's a bunch of different interpretations of things like drop boxes, of things like, when if a ballot should be counted, if a date is wrong, or if a signature is wrong, and how to handle those processes. It sounds like this task force from the governor is more focused on election security. He's been pretty vocal about his concerns that the 2024 election could be stolen, but just, after what happened in 2020, where President Trump and allies within the state Republican Party tried to use the government to question their election, to get alternate electors, to skew results for Trump when Biden won. I think this is just him attempting to be proactive, but, where the line between press release and task force and actions that will change how we run our elections is, that's something we'll see probably in the next couple months.
There are, lingering problems that we need to sort out. And you mentioned a lot of them, but, we still have the whole issue with the mail-in ballots and when they're counted and sort of how that leads to delay and how that's just going to create days of chaos if, in November, we have an uncertain election for 3 days while they count mail-in ballots because they've been unwilling to fix that problem.
I'd like to
True.
Oh, go ahead, Linda, please.
I think if it helps the elections regain people's trust, it would be a good thing.
Earlier this week, the Pennsylvania Capital Star reported that Democratic candidate for Treasurer Erin McClelland had raised and spent money for her campaign before formally registering this campaign with the Department of State. Stephen, can you talk about this a little bit? In particular, is it problematic that the McClelland campaign had made these potential campaign finance errors, and she's looking to oversee potentially billions of taxpayer dollars?
Yeah, I'll say I didn't write the story. I have been asking around about it because it kind of gets at this central issue of Pennsylvania's campaign finance laws are already quite lax, and the enforcement for them is even laxer still. It's a process that's driven by complaints, and most of the enforcement is supposed to be by district attorneys who often don't pursue charges. The issue is basically that Erin McClelland, who was a candidate for Democratic, be a Democratic candidate for county executive Allegheny County, looks like she may have used resources from that run to then finance her state level campaign, or some expenses for that. Now I think where in federal law, this is more of an issue because there are these strict restrictions on the amount of money you can give to a campaign, but Pennsylvania has no limits on campaign finance. So one could make an argument that it's kind of not a big deal because that campaign could give as much money as it wants to the state campaign and kind of doesn't matter. But then you get this issue, though, it's not being reported in the way it should be. She didn't register her campaign until January. Is it all by the books? It seems like it might not be, but I also just kind of, to me, it really shines a spotlight. And we saw Kathy Bukvar, the former Secretary of State, note that just this is, or she didn't say this, but I've had people tell me that we have a wild west when it comes to campaign finance laws and when it comes to government ethics laws. And to me, that struck me as a real takeaway. Is just like we have laws that are already loose and we don't know how to enforce them all that well. And so whether something super problematic happened or someone just made a paperwork error, that's what we need to find out more to know.
On the topic of elections, Linda, there was a special election in Bucks County earlier this month where the House Democratic caucus retained control of the House. Can you talk a little bit about their newest elected member, Jim Propriak?
Sure. He was a school board member at the time he was elected, and before that he was a Falls Township supervisor, so he was is an experienced politician, and the Democrats got $50,000 from the National Democrats to help fund his campaign, so he had plenty of money for signs and get out the vote, et cetera, et cetera. Also, there's about 20,000 registered Democrats in that district and only around 13,000 Republicans. So he was probably going to win no matter what the Republicans did.
Stephen, you've been writing about State House and Senate races to watch that could potentially flip. What's standing out to you right now?
I think what stands out is there's a lot of races to watch, and way more in the House than the Senate. The state Senate, there's probably only 4 districts, maybe 1 or 2 more could pop up, but and then the House, you're at about dozen, maybe it could get more. I guess the main thing that would strike me, though, if I look at all of them as a whole, is that both parties are on offense and defense. There are places that they got to hold. I mean, House Democrats have a member in Cambria County in a district that's voted for Trump by about 30 points. He's won consistently, Representative Frank Burns, but maybe this year is his year. And on the Republican side, they've had Dan Laughlin in Erie, which is a district that's voted for President Joe Biden. And is this the year Democrats take him out? I don't know. A lot of folks' white whales are on the ballot, and that particularly matters because with the Democrats in control of the House, the Senate's a bastion of the GOP, and the Republicans keeping a hold of that means they continue to have a voice in state government. They continue to throw up their hands, raise their concerns, and have leverage to back up those concerns versus just being on the backbench and saying, well, we don't like where this is going, but I guess all you can do is vote no and let Democrats do what they want, which is what would happen if the Senate flips.
Do you see any potential that either chamber switches control?
I think there's always potential. It's too early for me to put money down.
John, do you think that being an election year has an impact on what lawmakers are willing to take up and cast a vote on?
Oh, absolutely, and that's everything that Stephen just said is that on the one hand you could look at it and say this is 2024 and there's presidential election. There's going to be all kinds of pressure for Republicans to say we're not doing anything to give anyone any victories this year. But at the same time, you've got a certain number of people who are running for election themselves and are going to want to have to go to their voters and explain that they're doing something. That is going to be a huge issue, particularly when you've got really interesting issues on the plate like minimum wage, marijuana legalization, all this school funding. I mean, they are huge things that we need to confront, and it's a question of whether or not we do it or not.
And people care about it, especially education.
Our guests have been John Finnerty, Bureau Chief for Capitolwire.com, Linda Stein, News Editor with the Delaware Valley Journal, and Stephen Caruso, Capitol Reporter for Spotlight PA. I'm Francine Schertzer. Thank you for watching.